Good morning, everyone, and thank you for hosting me. This talk will be partly about ancient Israel, partly about modern Israel, and partly about how historians are ill-equipped to understand what history is for. So, we'll hopefully pursue all these things and make it all stick. Let me just, before I start, let me share the screen. Share. Okay, I hope you can see this. So, this is the region we're talking about in antiquity. Two months ago, we all celebrated, those of us who are Jews, celebrated Passover. All the Jews in Texas, all Jews all over the world, all over the United States, all over the world, as Jews have done every year for the past 3,000 years. Now, those of you who participated in this even once know that the primary activity of this holiday is the Passover Seder. Okay, this big meal in which, other than the eating, the big event, it's not even other than eating. The big event, the big activity is telling the story of the Israelites' exodus from Egypt. Okay, this is the creation story, telling the creation story of the Jewish nation. And even the food is part of the telling of the story. So even the food is secondary, and the meal is secondary to the telling of the history story, the national history. And so every year, the whole family or groups of families and friends get together and retell the story again. And you can add to that the Sabbath meal, where every week, as you bless the candles, you include a section that refers to the exodus from Egypt and God choosing the Jewish people to liberate them. And then add to that, virtually every holiday in the Jewish calendar includes a ritual retelling of this or that part of the Exodus. Sukkot, Simchat Torah, Shavuot, etc. Now, the story of the Exodus has been challenged more effectively, less effectively, doesn't matter now, but it's been challenged by historians and archaeologists. And yet, Jews keep telling, even Jews who don't think that the story is accurate or even at all true, keep telling the story to themselves and their children. Okay, and then so the obvious question is, why do people who don't think this really happened, or this is an accurate depiction of our history, why do they do it? Well, what's the function of this storytelling? And the answer, as you can see over history, what it meant to people is that, or again, the social function or the anthropological function of it is that it tells the children and reminds the adults where we came from, what our forefathers went through, what this nation or group stands for, okay, what we're all about as a people. And it's the same function that you see enacted in every family reunion, where people wind up talking about the exploits of various ancestors, living and dead, about when they moved to the States from the old country, how mom met dad, the story about the uncle who died in World War II, the great-grandfather who fought in the Civil War, the aunt who married a communist. These stories, of course, aren't as formalized as a Passover Seder or a formal history lesson, but they perform the same function. It's a retelling of stories that everyone already knows for the benefit of the kids who are now hearing them for the first time. And also for the benefit of the adults who like rehearing and retelling them. Yeah, so these stories tell everyone involved who we are as a family, where we came from, what kind of family this is, and again, what this family is about. Um, and 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 so these stories function as history lessons, which don't simply tell information; they integrate newcomers. They integrate newcomers into the group. Okay, the newcomers are children and in-laws, people who marry into this family. Okay, so these stories integrate these newcomers into a group of old-timers by telling them our stories about us, about the group that they're joining. And while doing so, these stories also cement and reinforce existing bonds between the adults, between the old-timers. Okay, this is our history, these are our stories, and these stories explain what kind of people we came from and what kind of people we are. Okay, and this explains why in these family reunions you'll hear stories about the uncle who fought in World War II, but not about the uncle who was arrested for embezzlement, right? Or the grandfather who killed a child driving drunk, or about the grandmother who never married but had 3 children from 3 different fathers. Right? So, you know, so when you look at this at the stories we tell and the stories we don't tell, it is a question. I mean, we all know that we do this. We tell these stories, but not those stories. But it is a question. Why is this? You know, why do we tell newcomers to the family, again, children and in-laws, that they're joining a family of good people rather than a family of degenerates or a family of so-so people, a family of people who are not very admirable? You know, certainly part of it is, you know, you want people to think well of you. You know, so it's kind of a stroking your own ego, but if you think beyond this kind of surface level, which is of course true, but if you think of the anthropological logic behind it, okay, what function do these good, positive stories serve, and what effect would the negative stories have? Then you'll see that if you told, you know, if you consider what would happen if we told our kids about all the terrible things that they're, or terrible or unimpressive things that their uncles and cousins and grandparents and parents and their brothers and sisters have done over the years. Okay, it would counteract the function of the family, because when you think of what a family is, what does a family do? A family is a mutual assistance society. It's a community in which people are taught that they're a community. It's a group of people who are taught that they are a community, that they are beholden to one another, that they're attached to one another, and that they owe each other all sorts of services that they do not owe to other people. And the clearest example is if you think what you would do if a stranger knocked on your door and told you that, you know, hi, I'm your Aunt Thelma's son, and I need a place to crash for the night. Okay? And by comparison, what would you do if another stranger knocked on your door and told you that he's your neighbor's, Aunt Louise's son, and he needs a place to crash for the night? Of course, you'd send him over to your neighbor. You're his cousin, not mine. It's his responsibility to take care of you. It's not my responsibility. Okay, so both of them are complete strangers to you. But you have an emotional and ethical obligation to the stranger who is your cousin, which you do not have to the stranger who is not your cousin. Okay? So so what would happen if you tell our children, if you tell these newcomers, again, the children and the in-laws who are joining our family, that this family is full of not very nice people, not very impressive people, not very good people. Okay? The effect, you'd be transmitting a message about this group of people that you are joining, that you newcomers are joining, that would make the family not function very well as a family. Okay? The family, these kinds of stories would not inspire these newcomers to care about these people who are now their family. Okay, who'd be inspired by these kinds of stories, of these negative stories? Who'd be inspired? Who'd be happy to join this group of people? Who would be proud to call himself a member of this family? Who would be inspired to want to help these people in times of need? Okay, you'd probably be thinking, well, I know who what kind of people these are. They won't help me. They won't help my brother. They won't help my cousin. So why should I help their brother or their cousin? Okay, you'd feel that you're being duped here. Okay, that it doesn't inspire you to give assistance to a group that you know is not very honorable and not very likely to give you assistance. And so that explains the choice of stories we tell at family reunions. And nations are like families. Okay? Nations are also a nation is a mutual assistance society. And nations work only if people feel sentimental about other people, strangers, who belong to the same nation. Nationalism, the effect of nationalism, the magical effect of nationalism, is that it turns millions of strangers into a kind of family, into these strangers that you don't know and will never see personally, but you feel a sort of bond with them, like an emotional connection to them, and mutual, I don't know if affection is the word, but you feel like you're a community. Okay? Even though you're spread out geographically and split up by all sorts of divisions. So the effect is that when people in Houston or New York or Oregon are attacked by nature or by malevolent humans, you feel attacked. Okay? And you sympathize with these strangers in faraway locations, and then you offer your help. Okay? You want to do something about it. Okay, and if it's a human attack, like a terrorist attack or a foreign army attacking, then you not just want to help, you feel that you've been attacked, and you feel anger and resentment. And by contrast, if the same thing happens to people in Madrid or Bucharest, again, if they are subject to some sort of heinous attack or to a natural disaster, you still feel bad for them, but you move on with your life. You don't feel the same impact on you personally. It's the difference if the attack happens, just inside our border or just outside our border, the effect on you is completely different because of the effect that nationalism has had on your psyche. So you wind up caring about what happens in a schoolroom, what the curriculum is in Montana and Massachusetts and California, but not in Mexico and Canada. You care about healthcare in Michigan, but not healthcare in Greece. Or about crime in Idaho, but not crime in Guatemala. So what I'd like to discuss with you today is this kind of dynamic where we tell certain episodes in our history in a certain way, how we've retold or highlighted episodes in the Jewish past in a way that a retelling in which historical accuracy and archaeological truth play second fiddle to the ideological and to the needs of a national community, of a national movement. Specifically, what I want to talk about today is the ways in which the Zionist movement, consciously and subconsciously, I'm assuming mostly consciously, viewed or interpreted or tweaked ancient Jewish history in a way that reaffirmed the Zionist worldview, specifically Zionist assumptions regarding Jewish nationhood. Here, let me put up a glossary of terms for those who aren't familiar with all the terms that we're going to cover today. So Zionism, just to clarify to those who aren't in the know, Zionism is the name of the Jewish national movement. It comes from the word Zion, which is simply a synonym for Jerusalem, and by implication, a synonym for the Holy Land as a whole, for the land of Israel. So if you believe that Jews are a nation and therefore deserve to have a state in which they govern themselves, just like the Poles have Poland and the Swiss have Switzerland, then you're a Zionist. Okay? It's the same logic that makes, Kurdish and Tibetan nationalists today demand an independent Kurdistan and an independent Tibet. And Zionism was born at the same time as other European national movements in the second half of the 19th century. And it accomplished its goal of establishing the state of Israel about 70 years later, in 1948. Now, Zionists, generally speaking, did not have much appreciation for the 2,000 years of Jewish life in the diaspora, meaning in exile, outside the state of Israel, the land of Israel, excuse me. Zionists felt, these activists who wanted the Jews to go to their ancient homeland and establish an independent Jewish state, they felt that the attitude, that the diaspora mindset is what was the main problem hounding the Jewish people. Okay, and kept them in the diaspora and kept them from reestablishing, regaining control over their lives. Okay, and so this was the attitude that Zionism was combating. Okay, the mindset of the Jews in the diaspora. Okay, and therefore they didn't feel connected to the Jewish culture and heritage established in 2,000 years of exile. Instead, they felt connected to their to the biblical era and the classical era. So 2,000 years ago, up to 3,000 years ago, or 4,000 years ago, depending on your timing. So they felt connected to periods in which Jews saw themselves as a nation and conducted themselves as a nation. So they either had a national state or they aspired and fought for national independence. And therefore, it's no surprise that Zionists were drawn to the Jewish revolts against Rome, the Great Rebellion of 66 AD, 66 to 73 AD, and the Bar Kokhba Rebellion of 132 to 135 AD. Because it was the suppression of these two rebellions that ended Jewish national sovereignty for the next, and sent the Jews into exile, into the diaspora, for the next 2,000 or 1,800 years. Now, this is a map of biblical, of the land of Israel in biblical times. And we'll be using this map of Judea, the province of Judea in Roman times. So we don't have time to go into the history of these rebellions, of the two Jewish wars in great detail. So I'll be extremely brief and sparse with the details. So the Great Revolt broke out in 66 AD. It was a product, well, there's debate about what were the preconditions for it, but it was a product of years of corrupt government, corrupt Roman or pro-Roman government in the province of Judea, exacerbated or punctuated by religious and ethnic strife between Greek populations in Judea and Jewish and the Jewish population, the Jewish majority in Judea. And this rivalry between Greeks and Jews was exacerbated by Roman policy, because the Romans gave preferential treatment to Greeks who usually had Roman citizenship, and the Jews who were not Roman citizens felt aggrieved by it. And all sorts of, again, it's complicated, but in broad terms, that was the background for the rebellion that eventually broke out. Once the rebellion broke out, Jewish armies took control of the Galilee and of the Judean desert, so in the north and the south. But eventually they were defeated by Vespasian and his son Titus. The Romans ended up killing hundreds of thousands of Jews, destroying the Jewish temple, and building a Roman temple in its place. They appointed a new governor in Judea and placed a full Roman legion plus other non-Roman troops as auxiliaries as a permanent garrison in this very small province. And all of these measures led to increased Jewish immigration from Judea, either to other parts of the empire or outside the empire to the east. At the tail end of the rebellion, you look at this region right here where I'm marking with the cursor. So at the tail end of the rebellion, after the fall of Jerusalem, a number of Jewish rebels holed up in this mountain fort called Masada on the shores of the Dead Sea. And the story we're told by Josephus, he had been a Jewish rebel in this war, who was captured by Vespasian, and he became Vespasian's slave, or he became a member of Vespasian's household, and he was the personal chronicler of Vespasian's and his campaign in Judea. So the story we're told by Josephus is that the Romans camped at the foot of the mountain, but then a massive effort to, so they camped, they had this massive effort to build earthworks that would allow them to roll their siege engines to the top of the mountain. And during this tremendous engineering effort, the rebels and the troops fought viciously. You know, the rebels tried to undermine and prevent the Romans from building this earthwork and moving their siege machines up the mountain. But eventually the Romans were able to do it. And as they were burning down the gates to the fort at the top of the mountain, the defenders' leader gave a very passionate and patriotic speech and convinced the 960 men, women, and children to commit mass suicide rather than allow themselves to get captured and enslaved by these invading foreign Gentiles. And so when the Romans finally broke into the fort, expecting a continued fight, you know, the stiff resistance that they faced all along, as they went up the mountain, they instead found the entire place silent and everybody dead. Okay, so the Jews would not allow themselves to be captured, preferring death over defeat and slavery. It's a very famous story, and there have been a number of movies about it. The one I remember from when I was a kid was with Peter O'Toole and Peter Strauss. A very good movie. And it's a story that has played an important function in modern Jewish history, and especially it played an important role in the history of Zionism and the state of Israel. But before we get to that, let me go on to briefly to explain what happened in the second rebellion, the Bar Kokhba rebellion, which broke out about 50 years later in 132 AD. So the spirit of rebellious, of dissent and resistance, of kind of nationalist resistance and resentment against Roman rule, and religious messianic resistance to, again, to being governed by a pagan power and not being able to, for the Jews not being able to live their religious lives fully, as in the days of yore, since biblical times. This resentment towards Rome and towards Jewish collaborators with Rome simmered ever since the Great Revolt. Okay, so the mindset, the resentment, the nationalist impulses and religious impulses that led to the Great Rebellion continued after the Great Rebellion. But it was more on the, it was more potent on the margins of society. It was fueled by a sense of injustice, of mistreatment by Roman officials, of hostility by Greek populations and Roman soldiers and Roman officials to Jews and to Judaism. But the established leadership, community leadership, rabbinical leadership in Judea, worked to calm down the population, to push this resentment and militancy to the margins of the community, out of fear of Roman retaliation. Okay, we already got slaughtered, X number of years ago. Let's not recreate that kind of provocation. Let's not provoke another Roman repression. So put your heads down, be patient, and don't initiate another catastrophe like the Great Revolt. However, at around 130 AD, Roman policy in Judea gave a boost to the militants. Okay, Roman policy in Judea demonstrated to more people that the rabbis were wrong, and that the established political leadership in Judea, Jewish leadership, was wrong to urge submission and urge acquiescence to Roman rule. Okay, and basically Roman policy gave credence to the argument of the militants that we see Roman intentions clearly, and the rabbis and the established leaders are blind, or worse. Okay, that the Romans are out to get us. The Romans are out to suppress us and displace us. Okay, and you need to listen to us, to open your eyes to the Roman agenda, rather than listen to the established leadership that is telling you to acquiesce, put your head down, and endure it. And what really turned the tide was the Emperor Hadrian's declaration of his intention to plant a Roman colony of retired soldiers in Jerusalem. Okay? And at that point, some of the moderate leaders, led by the 90-year-old Rabbi Akiba, was the greatest spiritual leader in the land at the time. Some of these moderate leaders and Akiba himself came to support the rebellion. they switched their positions. So he voted against it. He voted for it after voting against it. And Rabbi Akiba became the spiritual leader of the revolt. And in time, he even supported the claim of Bar Kokhba, was the military leader of the revolt, that he, Bar Kokhba, was the Messiah. Okay, so this movement was nationalist and religious from the start, with messianic overtones. And at some point during the rebellion, at the height of Jewish success, Akiba gave his spiritual authority to this claim that this fellow really is the Messiah. Now, unlike the Great Revolt of '66, in which the rebels could hope for Parthian support from the east, this was this other great empire in the region, in the area of modern Iraq, Iran. So unlike the Great Revolt, in which there could be hope for military assistance from outside Judea, now in 132, the Parthians were not a factor, and there were no disturbances elsewhere in the empire that would prevent the Romans from saturating Judea with legions to put down any rebellion. But again, you have to channel how they thought. This was a messianic movement. They believed that they were continuing the great biblical struggles, the great struggles, the great military conflicts that Jews fought the previous 1,000 years, and the fight against the Greeks, which again, the small number of Jews fought against the mighty empire and won because of divine assistance. And so they thought that God was fighting with them. And so the logic of numbers and troop strength and diplomatic assistance from a foreign power didn't come into play as much. And so this hopeless rebellion finally broke out in the spring of 132. Its leader was a fellow by the name of Simon Bar Kosiba, also known as Bar Koziva, which means in Hebrew, son of a lie, and also known as Bar Kokhba, which means son of a star. So the discrepancy regarding his name clearly reflects the mixed attitudes of his contemporaries and of future generations of Jews towards this rebellion. And some Jews saw him as a false prophet, son of a lie, and the author of a doomed adventure and a catastrophe for the Jewish people, whereas others saw him as the Messiah, or as either as the Messiah in religious terms, again, son of a star, Star of David, or as an admirable national leader we should admire rather than castigate. Okay, and that's reflected in the name, the laudatory name of Bar Kokhba, appellation of Bar Kokhba. Now, the war itself was a guerrilla campaign or terrorist campaign against Roman forces against Roman forces, Greek populations, and Jewish populations or Jewish individuals who collaborated with Roman authorities. It was primarily it was exclusively a southern Judean revolt. Okay, it took place, okay, actually I need to clarify. Judea is a region, this region, when you hear of Judea and Samaria and the West Bank, for example, okay, so Judea is, geographically speaking, this region. But politically, it was the name of the entire province, okay? The Roman province of Judea. So this rebellion, the first rebellion, the Great Revolt, took place in the entire province, north to south. This rebellion took place only in the geographic region, roughly, of Judea, okay, in the southern part of the province of Judea, meaning that the Galilee, the Jews of the Galilee, and the coast, the middle and northern coast, did not participate in this, did not join the uprising. Okay? Roman control of the north and the northern coast and the middle coast were never in jeopardy. And the rebellion ended with the Romans suppressing the rebellion with a very harsh and very effective scorched earth policy against these guerrillas and against their civilian support system. According to Roman records or Roman accounts, Bar Kokhba was captured and executed. According to Jewish accounts, Bar Kokhba fought like Davy Crockett at the Alamo to the last bullet and died while defending the last Jewish stronghold of Beitar. The results were even more devastating than the results of the previous rebellion. Rome changed the name of Judea to Palestina, changed the name of Jerusalem to Ilia Capitolina. The Jewish tax was increased throughout the empire, and Jewish proselytization, Jewish missionary activity among Gentiles was banned, or basically it was conversions to Judaism were banned by law throughout the empire. And all the things I'll mention were conscious efforts by the Romans to de-Jewify Judea. Okay, they've noticed the obvious, that this population is particularly troublesome. It is, I skipped over one rebellion. In the last 50 years, from the Great Revolt to the Bar Kokhba Revolt, there were 3 rebellions, 2 in Judea, the Great Revolt and the Bar Kokhba Revolt, and 1 in the provinces, in the eastern provinces of the empire, called the diaspora revolts. And so the Romans understood, finally, that this population in the empire is particularly resistant to Roman rule because of their religious fixation, this monotheism, and because of their nationalist fixation, which made them incompatible with the kind of multinational, multicultural, multi-religious empire that the Romans were running. And so you have here an effort, after a successful effort on the Romans' part, to reduce the Jewish population and the Jewish influence in Judea, and increase the non-Jewish population and non-Jewish influence in Judea. So everything I told you, so changing the name of the province, changing the name of Jerusalem, increasing the Jewish tax, banning conversions to Judaism, 50 forts in Judea and 985 towns and villages were razed to the ground. 600,000 Jews in southern Judea died during the war, either from military action or starvation and disease due to the scorched earth campaign. And these 600,000 dead represented 75% of the population of southern Judea. 75% of the southern part of the province perished. It's a mind-blowing number. On top of that, tens of thousands of South Judeans were sold into slavery, and Jews were forbidden on pain of death from entering the city of Jerusalem and the surrounding area of about a radius of about 30 miles around the city. And all the Jewish property in that radius around the city of Jerusalem was confiscated. So on top of the 600,000 who died in the war, and the tens of thousands who were enslaved and shipped wherever, tens of thousands more, at least, were rendered homeless and impoverished, leading to a mass exodus of Jews from Judea to Parthia in the east, and to the north to Asia Minor, or to the west either to North Africa or a few to Europe. Also, rabbis were forbidden to teach Jewish law and were forbidden to ordain new rabbis. Again, you can see here a program to combat, to dilute, to combat Judaism as a religious force and as a national category, to break up the things that tie Jews together into this kind of national community. And so because of this prohibition on teaching, on rabbis teaching the law and ordaining new rabbis, many of the leading rabbis, many rabbis and rabbinical students fled to other parts of the empire or to Parthia. And it was aided by the fact that a number of leading rabbis and their students were imprisoned and executed when they were found illegally teaching. And the most prominent among these executed leaders was Rabbi Akiba himself. The last effect was that the Romans sponsored a tremendous building program in Judea, in Palestina, and placed and doubled the size of the Roman garrison in Judea to 2 full legions, plus the same number of auxiliary forces. It's a very large garrison for such a small province. And all accounts of this rebellion, ancient accounts, medieval and modern, agree that the devastation following this rebellion far eclipsed the devastation that followed the Great Revolt. And really, with the exception of the Nazi Holocaust, the suppression of the Bar Kokhba rebellion was the worst catastrophe to hit the Jewish people in their history. And that's certainly true in terms of a body count, but also in terms of national assets. The process of Jews emigrating from Judea, which began after the Great Revolt, was dramatically accelerated by the suppression of the Bar Kokhba revolt. And by the late classical era, by the 4th century or so, the Jews had become a landless people until about 140 years ago, when Zionists renewed the Jewish claim to the national homeland. Now, as I mentioned before, the early Zionists were drawn to these rebellions against Rome, against the Greeks beforehand, the Hanukkah story, and against and these 2 rebellions against Rome, because they saw themselves as descendants of those nationalists, and they saw themselves, the Zionists of the late 19th and early 20th century, saw themselves as completing their historic mission. That this fight, the Zionist fight for a national state, was simply a continuation, was picking up the flag, picking up the banner of those nationalists from 2,000 years ago. And we are finally realizing that dream today in the 1930s, 40s, 50s. Now, as I pointed out when I explained Zionism, the Zionists' first mission was to revive the national spirit or identity among Jews in the diaspora. They saw this as their most difficult challenge, to convince Jews in Central Europe and Western Europe, European Jews, that they were not merely a religious minority in Europe, but rather a national minority. That they are a national group, and therefore that they deserve a nation state. Because religious groups, and in this nationalist era, with this national mindset and national logic, religions don't get states. Okay, Muslims don't have a Muslim state, Christians don't have a Christian state, but the French have France, the Serbs have Serbia, the Russians have Russia, okay, the Swedes have Sweden. And so they were trying to convince European Jews, you are a nation just like Serbs, just like Swedes, and you deserve, and therefore you should buy into this idea of a Jewish state. Now this question or tension over what Judaism is it a nation? Is it an ethnic group? Is it a religion? Is it all of the above? Is it some of the above? This tension is there only in the modern era. Judaism, since the time of the Bible, was not a religion primarily, but a family. It was a nation, a people. A nation that had its own religion. It had a special relationship with God, and that was part of being a member of this community of the Jewish people. Of course, you can join this family, just like you can join my family or your family. And this process includes joining a relationship with God, with this nation's God. But so this was the traditional Jewish understanding of what Judaism is. But in the 18th and 19th centuries, once European Jews were emancipated, and for the first time had the opportunity to get citizenship in their home countries, in France, Germany, England, etc., they embraced emancipation, and they attempted to really integrate themselves into Europe's nation states, Germany, France, etc., etc. Of course, the problem in joining the French nation is that if you join the French family, then you cannot maintain allegiance or maintain your identity and understanding of your membership in the Jewish family. Okay, so Jews embraced emancipation in Europe, in Central and Western Europe, where it was offered, by ditching this notion of Judaism as a family, as a nation. Okay, these emancipated Jews saw themselves as Frenchmen of the Jewish religion, Englishmen of the Jewish religion. Okay, so just like there are French people who are Catholic and French people who are Protestant, there are also French people who are Jewish. It's a religious identity, not a national identity. Okay, so they define themselves as a package deal with emancipation. They define themselves as a religious minority rather than a national minority, national group. And they therefore developed a new religion, Reform Judaism. Okay, a religious identity, a religious denomination that explicitly rejected Jewish nationhood, declaring that Judaism was a religion, was merely a religion. The Jews were a religious minority in France, Germany, England, America, etc. So, for example, when the leaders of the American Jewish Reform movement met in Pittsburgh in 1885 to shape their theological framework, they wrote in their founding document that we are no longer a nation, but a religious community. And as you might expect, Reform Judaism Reform and conservative Judaism is today the largest denomination among diaspora Jews, Jews who live outside of Israel and see themselves as regular Americans or Argentines or Canadians or Englishmen, etc., just of a different religious identity. Okay? But in Israel, where Jews live in a Jewish nation state, Reform Judaism is virtually non-existent. Okay? All Israeli Jews have that ancient Jewish the traditional Jewish understanding of Judaism as a nation. Now, modern anti-Semitism objected to the emancipation of Jews and to their integration into European nations, because they, as members of that, having, they thought in national, or some of them in racial terms even, but they rejected the idea that Jews could be real Germans or real Russians or real Frenchmen, just with a different religion, because modern anti-Semitism argues, again, according to the nationalist logic, that Jews are a nation, okay, and therefore they should not be in France or Germany or England. Germany is for Germans, not for other people. And Zionists of that period shared the same nationalist mindset. Of course, they weren't anti-Semitic, they weren't self-hating Jews, but they shared this. I guess it was a two-pronged force. Number one, they bought into the nationalist logic that all Europeans were buying into at the time. Okay, of groups with a shared past, shared language, a shared religion, sometimes religion, conceiving themselves as nations and demanding national self-determination. But on top of that, on top of Jews being a part of this intellectual movement that we call nationalism, they also saw daily evidence in Eastern Europe, in Western Europe, in Central Europe, that emancipation is a farce. Okay, that this bargain the Jews were expected to make of accepting citizenship and leaving their Jewish national identity and embracing French national identity or German national identity, that was not, that trade-off was not being honored. Okay, that emancipated Jews were not in fact accepted as French citizens, French people of a different religion. Okay, they saw evidence, like I said, from Eastern Europe to Western Europe, that the people were not buying this idea that Jews can be real Russians, real Germans, real Frenchmen. Okay, and so it's partly by real embrace of nationalism and partly by noticing the rejection from the non-Jewish community that the Zionists double down on this idea that we are a nation, we need to go to the land of Israel and demand a state just like every other national group. So the Zionist movement had two objectives from its inception. The second objective was to get international support for a Jewish state in the land of Israel, their ancient homeland. But the first objective was to convince European Jews to open their eyes and get the message, to understand their true position in Europe, to understand that they will never be accepted in Europe as normal members of their various nations, and that they therefore should leave and move to the land of Israel and try to reestablish a Jewish national homeland there. Okay? So to internalize, to remember that they are a nation, not a religious group. After all, Zionism is a national movement. So, so stories of a Jewish national past were crucial to this PR effort among among Jews. And so Zionist history textbooks celebrated historical episodes like the Jewish revolts against the Greeks and the Romans. In the story of Hanukkah, the story of Masada, the story of Bar Kokhba. Since these accounts were evocative and inspiring illustrations of the fact that Jews were, in their past, a nation and had fought and died heroically for national liberation. These stories like these illustrated that Jews had valued their national independence so much that they preferred death to living under Roman rule. And I'm sure you recognize every national, I'm sure you recognize these kinds of stories because every national movement has its give me liberty or give me death stories, to inspire followers or shame followers into committing themselves to the nation, to the national project, whatever it is. Okay, so all national movements refer to a golden age in the past in which the group, the nation was united, was committed, was heroic, and offered mutual assistance to one another. And these stories of an ideal or idealized past are used by national movements and national governments to inspire and revive those virtues, those national virtues, and that unity that had characterized the group in that past age. And I'm sure that you're familiar with these, as Americans, that you're familiar with the stories. Oh, I apologize in advance. The lawnmowers are outside, and I hope the dogs don't go crazy as they do. In any case, apologies in advance. So, so you know that Americans tell themselves certain stories to convey to themselves and their children and their immigrants all these newcomers, okay? To convey the idea of an American nation and educate one another and educate newcomers on what it means to be an American, okay, and what the American national character is, okay? That we're not just a bunch of people who happen to live here. We are a real community with certain national traits and a national identity and national agenda that is common to us. Okay, so and you all grew up on these stories: the Alamo, Little House on the Prairie. It always still doesn't boggle my mind, but I lament it that when I mentioned Little House on the Prairie in this context to my students, they don't know what I'm talking about. Nobody's read those books, and nobody saw the shows. It's fine. But in any case, so stories like the Americans who fought for independence and liberty in 1776, the winter at Valley Forge, the civil rights movement, the Civil War, the Greatest Generation, going out and defeating the Nazis, et cetera, the Oregon Trail, how the West was won. So the reason Americans tell themselves these stories is that they convey some sort of message about what the national virtues and national traits of this community of people, these millions of people who happen to who live here, what unites them? What common traits do they have? Okay. And the stories, all the stories that I recounted now, convey a message that we are fair, capitalist, hardworking. We support individual liberty, and individual liberty is important to us. We have integrity, we're self-sacrificing, we're courageous, etc. Okay. So we choose to tell certain stories, and that we prefer our national agenda, whatever it might be. We value it so much that we're even willing to sacrifice our lives for it, either on the shores of Normandy, or in Korea, or on the battlefields of the Civil War or the American Revolution, or or in the freedom rides in the American South during the 1950s and 60s, and the marches, etc. So we choose to tell ourselves certain stories, some true, some embellished, and we choose to not tell ourselves other stories. Okay, so we talk about Valley Forge, we talk about the civil rights movement, but we don't talk about the massive desertions from the Continental Army or about the O.J. Simpson trial and O.J. Simpson and the Rodney King riots. Okay? Or about the busing riots in Boston. Okay? Because these, it's not that they're not true stories, but they're not nationalizing stories. Okay? They're not national stories. They're not meaningful stories about who we are. Okay? Just like all those stories that we don't tell at the family reunion. And this is where the Masada story comes into play. Masada is the Israeli version of the Alamo. School children are taken up the hill to hear the story of those brave forefathers of Jewish nationhood. Soldiers in elite units are sworn in at the top of the mountain after marching in full gear up the hill. And ever since Masada, ever since the Great Revolt, Masada has been a lesson to Jews in the diaspora, as to what is the admirable way or heroic way to behave in the face of attacks and pressure from their Gentile neighbors. Okay, so fight like heck or flee, but when all else fails, prefer death to capture, rape, enslavement, and forced conversion. Okay? Death is preferable to that kind of domination and humiliation. Not that Jews regularly committed suicide to avoid these things. In fact, they rarely did, but that's where the bar was set. You know, that's what was considered heroic Jewish conduct. And occasionally Jews really did live up to that ideal. Okay, we see it on a mass scale, Jews lived up to that bar in the diaspora revolts and the Bar Kokhba revolt against Rome. They did so again in those of you who are familiar with the mass suicide of the Jews of York in England in the 12th century. And they did so on a small scale, on an individual level, during the Crusades and during the pogroms in Poland and Russia, and think of the Warsaw Ghetto uprising against the Nazis. Okay? Nobody thought that they had a chance to win. It was clearly a suicide rebellion. Similarly, during World War II, when the Nazis took over Syria and Lebanon in the north and threatened to take Egypt from the British in the south, it seemed that obviously the next stage would be that they would take over the land of Israel. And so the Zionist settlers there made plans for defense of the southern border with Egypt against the Nazi invasion if and when it took place. But if and when that failed, or if that failed, they also made plans for a mass suicide, just like at Masada. It's a tremendously powerful national symbol, as is the Alamo. Again, I don't need to tell Texans that. And the message it transmits to the young is the same. You know, that our forefathers were truly impressive in their commitment to our national values and ideals. Okay, whether it's the civil rights movement, or the Greatest Generation, or Masada, or the Alamo. And we today should live up to their legacy and commit ourselves to our national mission as they had done. Okay, so Sonny, get off the couch, stop playing your stupid Xbox, and do something meaningful. You know, be less like you and more like your grandfather. Okay, that's the message of these greatest generation kind of stories. Just like they fought and sacrificed their comfort and their livelihoods and their security and their lives and their loved ones, so should we. Okay? Our ideals and our collective freedom are more valuable than our individual comfort and accomplishments and even our individual safety and lives. It's kind of like if you think of the message that stories like Ted Williams leaving baseball and going to fight for his country. Okay, leaving all those opportunities on the table for something bigger than his own accomplishment, his own agenda, personal agenda. Okay, so that's why we tell these stories. Again, the Greatest Generation, Passover story of the Exodus, the civil rights marches, Little House on the Prairie, etc. So that's where Masada comes in. Now, the fascinating part about this story is that this great battle of Masada probably never happened. Probably. The person who, oh, sorry, I should have shown you the picture of Masada. Here's the mountain and the earthworks going up it from the Romans, and here's the palace, the original palace that Herod built here, and a replica of it. Okay, so the person who is responsible for perpetuating the Masada story and building it up further to make it such a powerful national symbol for the state of Israel, or for the Jewish people in the modern era, in the 20th and 21st century, was one of the founding fathers of the state of Israel, this guy here, a fellow by the name of Yigael Yadin, who was a senior officer in the resistance against the British. And then after 1948, he rose to be the chief of staff of the Israeli army, and later on an influential member of the Israeli parliament. He was also an archaeologist, and he was the one who uncovered a lot of the groundbreaking artifacts in and around Masada, and he literally wrote the book on Masada. And basically, his archaeological findings substantiated the account that Josephus left us of that battle. And I should mention that Josephus is the only ancient source we have to suggest that this dramatic drama had taken place at Masada. And Josephus is kind of a tricky historical witness because of his unique situation of being a captive in the household of the Roman general. So, so there's questions about there's always a question about ancient historians about how much is reliable history and what is embellishment, is fictionalized account to accomplish a certain political or educational purpose. But and so Yadin, in his role as a scientist, depending on if you consider history and archaeology as a science, but what Yadin did was to lend his considerable academic credibility to the account left by Josephus. He found artifacts that confirm that this is not just a tall tale, but real history. This really happened. About a generation later, in the early 1980s, however, a young Israeli archaeologist named Sefi Ben Yosef published an account of his own findings at Masada. And he's part of a team of younger archaeologists. And they claim, Ben Yosef and his group, claimed that the evidence at the site suggests or indicates that there was no battle there. So they explain that battles have, they leave a signature, an archaeological signature on the land, and that signature is not there at Masada. Okay, they're saying no battle was ever fought at Masada. There's no evidence, archaeological evidence, all those telltale signs of battle, you do not find them there at Masada. Okay, which means that by the time the Romans arrived at the base of the mountain, the rebels maybe they had already evacuated the fort, probably. Maybe they moved to Egypt, who knows? Okay. What's clear, though, is that there was no battle, no resistance. Now, the Romans did build those earthworks and went up the mountain, et cetera, but so Ben Yosef speculates that maybe it was a military exercise, okay, without facing resistance. Okay, and all of us live in countries that also conduct military exercises. It costs a lot of money, a lot of logistical investment and manpower, et cetera, in military games and exercises for a variety of purposes, some military, some diplomatic and political. So, okay, so he says, maybe the Romans were conducting the same, had the same, maybe the same logic that drives us to conduct military exercises and games drove the Romans to conduct theirs. Again, various diplomatic purposes for them, especially after suppressing a rebellion, perhaps. In any case, he doesn't know. All he's saying is there was no battle here. So that's already pretty interesting, challenging a 2,000-year-old national memory. What's 10 times more interesting is that Ben Yosef and other scholars looked into Yadin's own research notes, and they claim, some more forcefully than others. And so some of these people who studied Yadin's notes claim, and this is a real bombshell, or a real bombshell accusation. I can't say that it's true, I simply don't know. But they accuse Yadin that he himself found the same findings and came to the same conclusions as Ben Yosef. Okay, that Yadin knew that there was no battle there at Masada. But being not just an archaeologist, but also a national and military leader at a crucial time in Israel's formation, Yadin felt, and in the history of the Jewish people, that Yadin felt that the myth of Masada was more important to Israel and the Jewish people, the Jewish nation, than the truth of Masada. And so he doctored or skewed the evidence to substantiate the story left to us by Josephus. Okay, so the message is that Yadin felt, again, according to his critics, I can't tell you if this is truth or just a libelous accusation. They claim that he felt that if this national myth, this historical and archaeological fiction, could help prevent another Holocaust, by convincing Jews in Europe and the United States and elsewhere that they were members of a nation, that if this story, if an archaeologist, a respected archaeologist came and said, this is true, and showed the artifacts and conveyed to Jews all over the world the story, that maybe they would re-remember that they are members of a nation, and therefore they would leave their host countries and come to Israel and be saved from the kind of murderous attacks that Jews were undergoing in North Africa and the Middle East exactly at that time in the 1950s, in the 40s and 50s, and the kind of murderous attacks they faced in Europe during the Holocaust and after the Holocaust. And what Russian Jews faced during the Cold War. So to him, if telling this white lie or this lie, again, according to his critics, could help save Jews from these kinds of this kind of terrible fate, to him it was a worthwhile trade-off. And the same development occurred with the early Zionist accounts of the Bar Kokhba rebellion. Okay, just like with Masada, the same with the Bar Kokhba rebellion. Following the revolt itself in the Talmud, Bar Kokhba, so in Jewish writings of the 2nd, 3rd, 4th centuries AD, Bar Kokhba was referred to as Bar Koziva, okay, the derogatory name meaning son of a lie, false prophet. And he was known as a false prophet, as a villain, as a man who was as the man responsible for the Jews' dispersal throughout the Mediterranean basin. Okay, the author of this terrible catastrophe that happened to the Jews. But Zionists, 2,000 years, 1,800 years later, 1,900 years later, found in him a national hero and a role model. Again, like Davy Crockett and Travis at the Alamo. You know, as part of the Zionist attempt to inspire European Jews to reconnect with their national heritage, to convince Jews and remind Jews that they were, in fact, a national group rather than merely a religious group. So just like the defenders of Masada, Bar Kokhba's warriors sacrificed themselves for the cause of national liberation, fighting against all odds and preferring death to subjugation, to slavery, to forced conversion. And that's where the importance of fighting to the death comes in, whether in the American Revolution or at the Alamo, or at Masada and Bar Kokhba's, at Beitar in Bar Kokhba's rebellion. Because in fighting to the death, the national cause was never really defeated. Even if those individuals were defeated, were killed, what they fought for never was. And again, I refer you to the inspirational and nationalizing stories that Americans tell themselves along the same lines of give me liberty or give me death. Think of Nathan Hale in the American Revolution. Think of the Greatest Generation, the fighting in World War II. Think of the Freedom Riders. Think of Martin Luther King himself. Okay? Think of what these stories do for the nation. The kind of these are national symbols of commitment to the nation and to the nation's mission. Okay, in this case, liberty, goodness. These are primarily these give me liberty or give me death stories are primarily nationalizing stories because they're educational. Okay? We can debate on how accurate the story that we all tell ourselves about civil rights movement, the American Revolution, Masada, etc. Some are more accurate than others, but the point is that they're all educational. They all inspire, or they're meant to inspire a certain way of thinking and a certain code of conduct. Okay, and they're effective. Yeah. In the case of Bar Kokhba, there was a very interesting survey in the 1970s in Israel that revealed that Israeli children who were raised in Israel within this Zionist community and studying in the Zionist educational system in Israel, that these children referred to Bar Kokhba overwhelmingly as Bar Kokhba. And in fact, most of them didn't even know the name Bar Kokhba. They knew Bar Kokhba. and they knew all about his heroic triumphs over the Roman enemy. Whereas the children of immigrants to Israel, these are children who grew up in Eastern Europe or the Mediterranean or the Middle East or North Africa, children who were not raised, not exposed to the Israeli educational system and Israeli popular culture, but rather their knowledge of ancient Jewish history came mostly from the Talmud. Okay? And what they knew were primarily negative stories about Bar Kokhba, and they weren't even aware of the name Bar Kokhba, of the laudatory name. They knew him either as Bar Kokhba or as Bar Koziva, the son of a lie. Okay. The Israeli kids, for the most part, were unaware of the final miserable defeat of Bar Kokhba and the very harsh consequences that followed. And if you look at textbooks from the 1950s, 60s, 70s, I'm not talking about college or high school that really did discuss the nitty-gritty, but the elementary school textbooks and kind of programs for children, they mentioned the Bar Kokhba's defeat very briefly, but quickly went on to end the narrative of Bar Kokhba from 135 BC AD, 2,000 years later, 1,800 years later, with the modern Zionist return to the land of Israel and the resurrection of the Jewish nation. Okay, so what these textbooks for elementary school children and kind of shows about Bar Kokhba, etc., what they said was that, they described the victories, the early success of the rebellion, establishing national independence, liberating the Jerusalem, rededicating the temple to Jewish worship, etc. And then they mention the defeat and then jump to the 20th century and point out that in the end, the great Roman Empire disintegrated and vanished, while the Jews continued to weave their way through history and finally succeeded in completing that task, in rebuilding their national, rebuilding themselves in their own land and being free once again, governing themselves once again. And so in this way, the Bar Kokhba story ends on a victorious note for the nation, okay, with the resurrection. Again, think of the story of the Alamo. It's a story of a defeat that paves the way for later victory. Okay. You had to wait a much shorter time in Texas history, but still the narrative is the same. Okay, with defeat followed by resurrection, but by eventual success. We can talk later if you want about the what shapes this kind of narrative, that ending it on what happens when you end it in failure, and what happens when you end it on a successful note. And the issue here is the credibility presented by a Messiah who is defeated and killed. Okay? This is, when you have a Messiah who is killed, and as he tries to complete his mission, his death is evidence, by all appearances, that he was a false prophet and that all of his followers were duped. Okay, and that's exactly how Bar Kokhba was seen for almost 2,000 years. It's like, if you will, the followers of Jesus, it's how the followers of Jesus Christ felt on Friday and Saturday after his execution. And remember, there are 3 days between his execution and his resurrection. Okay? So by all appearances, on Friday and Saturday, he was a false prophet. His crucifixion demonstrated that he is not the man who said he said he was. He is not the Son of God. He was a liar. He fooled us. We were all dupes and dopes for believing him and believing his lies. And now we're all lost. Okay? The movement is lost. The Romans are coming for us. But it all changed on Sunday. Okay? His resurrection completely rehabilitated his image and their faith in him. It's the same with Bar Kokhba. In the diaspora, in the 2,000 years of 1,800 years of life in the diaspora, with Judea standing in ruins and with Jews scattered as a landless and subjugated and humiliated people, Bar Kokhba was known as a scoundrel and a false prophet, as Bar Koziva. But that all changed in the newly constituted, resurrected Jewish state of Israel, where Jews fleeing persecution go to rebuild their lives and govern themselves. Okay? Russian Jews went there in the early 20th century. European Jews fled there in the 1940s. Middle Eastern Jews in the 1950s. Soviet Jews in the 1980s and 90s. European Jews fled there in the 1990s and 2000s. And European Jews flee there today, or move from France and elsewhere. So in the context of an independent Jewish state, Bar Kokhba was rehabilitated as a national hero and a prophet of Jewish nationhood and national self-determination. And he's known, therefore, as Bar Kokhba, not Bar Koziva. It's an interesting thing to compare him to Theodor Herzl, who played a similar kind of role, obviously not military, but a kind of a messianic role for Jews. Okay? And for those of you who don't know who Herzl is, this is an image of the man. And Herzl was the founder of the Zionist movement. Well, okay, he wasn't the founder. He was its most well-known and consequential figurehead in the. And he was the kind of locomotive behind the Zionist movement in its formative years in the late 19th and early 20th century. Because Zionism was at that time a fringe phenomenon in Jewish communities, barely a blip on the radar. But when he came to lead, when he became a convert to Zionism in the 1890s or so, he transformed this movement into a real international and political force in Jewish communities all over Europe and even beyond the Jewish world. He met with world leaders such as the Ottoman Sultan and prime ministers, etc., as the self-appointed leader of the Jewish people. He had this kind of presence and charisma to sell himself as the speaker of world Jewry. And so through this, again, this charisma and energy and audacity, he established himself as the prophet of the Zionist movement and as the most recognizable leader of world Jewry. So Bar Kokhba strikes me as a Herzl kind of figure in the sense that if the Nazis had conquered the land of Israel from the British in the 1940s, and all those Jews there had been slaughtered, or if in 1948 and 49, the invading Arab armies had succeeded and conquered the state of Israel, and again, with mass slaughter of those Jews to follow, we today would be talking about Herzl as a scoundrel, a false prophet, a Pied Piper who led the Jews to this second Holocaust. You know, we'd be talking about those Zionist fools who bought his baloney and went to the land of Israel like lemmings to be slaughtered, and to have their lands, which they purchased with hard-earned money and hard labor, taken over by the Arabs. Okay, we would think of him for centuries as we think about Bar Koziva and about Shabtai Tzvi, you know, as a false prophet and a scoundrel and a traitor. But the Nazis didn't win, and the Arabs didn't win. So we think of him as Bar Kokhba. Israel's survival saved Herzl's good name and made him a national hero. And it did the same thing for Bar Kokhba 1800 years after his death. Okay. So in the 1980s, at about the time when the Masada story, myth, began to be challenged by academics, Israeli scholars started to challenge, pursue this project of challenging the heroic and ideological telling of Jewish history by the State of Israel, by the Zionist movement, etc. And you know, in this is a project that academic historians do everywhere. You know, American historians do the same thing about American history, okay, challenging the national storyline on various aspects of history that are, again, the stories that we choose to highlight for national purposes. Again, Grace Generation, etc. Regarding the Jewish revolts, historians pointed out that Jews had survived over the generations, not thanks to those who put up a fight and rebelled against Rome, but rather thanks to those Jews who sat on the sidelines, those Jews who collaborated with the Roman rulers or acquiesced to them, those who urged peace and acquiescence and putting your head down, rather than those who urged to fight back and to aspire to act in resistance. Okay, so they point out that Jewish national survival through the centuries should be credited to the Peace Party and to Hellenized Jews and the Jews of the Galilee who sat out the revolt, rather than those Jews that the Zionist movement heralded as heroes, those who led the Great Revolt, those who led the Bar Kokhba revolt. And you can see the effect of this changed attitude in two state funerals that took place in the 1960s and the 1980s for bones of, you know, archaeological findings of ancient Jewish soldiers. Okay, so in 1969, the Israeli government happened to be a labor government, a left-wing government, buried the bones that Yadin discovered at Masada. Okay, it was a state funeral. Full military honors were given to these bones that were said to be those of the Jewish defenders of Masada. And it was a successful ceremony, performance, part of, again, telling the story of Masada and celebrating the heroism of our forefathers. In 1982, the Israeli government conducted a similar kind of reprised this funeral, this state funeral. This time it was a right-wing government for bones that archaeologists discovered that some said could maybe be bones of some of Bar Kokhba's warriors. These were bones that were found in the Judean desert. But between the 1960s and the 1980s, the public atmosphere in Israel had changed. Even though the government and government and military officials attended the ceremony just like they did in the first ceremony in the first state funeral in 1968 or so, 69. But the archaeologists refused to participate in the 1980s. Whereas if you're, of course, Yadin definitely lent his credibility to that state funeral in the 1960s. Okay, so the result is that the public didn't buy it. The general public viewed the whole thing with a kind of ridicule. It was seen by both sides of the political spectrum as a photo op for politicians based on shaky science. Let me stop sharing the screen. So it seems that the symbols of Masada and Bar Kokhba have been weakened in Israel due to academic challenges, which told the public that these myths have been doctored or manipulated to infuse the public with a certain message, a certain ideological message, to shape the consciousness of the public. And so as this academic challenge to national symbols continues, or if it continues, which by all accounts it is, then the Zionist national narrative will in time submit to history and archaeology, and Masada and Bar Kokhba will recede from the elevated and volatile domain of national symbolism to the obscurity of scholarly books and academic conferences and museum displays. And so what I'd like to end with is a question rather than a conclusion. I'd like to ask whether you see this as a positive or negative development. Okay, whether it's really important or good to correct national myths like Masada, Bar Kokhba, the Great Generation, Little House on the Prairie, Civil Rights Movement, etc. And again, let's assume, for the sake of argument, let's not get into a historical discussion here. Let's assume that the worst critics, that the most vociferous critics are correct, that these are all inaccurate or outright lies. Okay? Is it important, is it good to correct them? Okay? After all, they educate students and the general public to remain committed to various values that we all value: democracy, freedom, fairness, etc., equality. So who's really suffering if our kids are taught this stuff erroneously? If it educates them to be good, committed citizens and good people, okay? And if it makes history more interesting and more meaningful to for the general public. Okay? So Yadin, if we believe his critics, Yadin believed that this was a worthwhile trade-off to make. And so I was wondering if you agree or not. And I'll read your comments off the chat. I'm sorry we don't have the back and forth as we would in a face-to-face meeting. Okay, so the first two comments are about truth and about excluded groups. So that these are lies and therefore inappropriate. And the other is that these stories, these heroic stories, exclude marginalized groups. They talk about the nation, but only a certain slice of the nation. So this second one, the part about the critique about cutting out others from the narrative. I'm not sure. Look, if these stories that we tell ourselves about ourselves, if you think of the American stories, Plymouth Rock, the Great Generation, the American Revolution, Civil Rights Movement, the Civil War, westward expansion, September 11th. These are stories that encompass the entire American population. Okay, immigrants and old-timers and blacks and whites and men and women and poor and rich, and many of the stories that we do tell about the Great Generation, about civil rights movement, about the Civil War, about September 11th, in fact, highlight the different groups of Americans. And if you think of the World War II movies, there's this trope of patriotic movies that show the Polish immigrant from Chicago who serves alongside the Anglo Mayflower descendant from Massachusetts, and the black soldier from the South. I'm thinking of the Hitchcock movie Lifeboat. In any case, there's a legion. These kinds of accounts are legion, where there's an effort to show the American tapestry banding together for civil rights, for independence, for helping the September 11th victims, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm not sure that I'm not sure that's accurate about the American myths, the mythical stories, and about other national movements. I'm typically not as familiar with, but the other, Bob's point about telling white lies or lies for the purpose of civics, of indoctrinating people with the civic message that we want them to take away. Look, I mean, obviously, that's a scenario I set up. Is it important to correct these lies? If they're lies, again, that's a separate discussion and a huge debate, which we're not going to get into here. But let's assume that they're lies or certified histories. Okay. If you go back to that to the family reunion, and I hear I see another question here, making the same point that if you believe, Carolyn, that if you hold truth as a value, then you shouldn't tell lies. Okay. So again, it's a question. I'll ask you about your family reunions and about your individual families. Okay. Telling your children a certified history or an edited history, where you highlight episodes you like to highlight and you downgrade or cover up episodes you don't want to publicize. Stories about when you tell your children stories about their family and their ancestors, I don't think you're doing it out of vanity, but rather you're doing it because you want to allow your children to have a family that functions like a family. Okay? You think it's better for your kid to have the Disney version of the family story than the Quentin Tarantino version. So we all make that trade-off that Yadin made, in sacrificing truth for some sort of higher cause, what you or he or I think is a higher cause. Okay? We all do it when we choose when we choose not to tell the children that daddy had an affair, or that or tell a kid that he's adopted. Okay, that unlike your brothers, you're not our biological child. Okay, we think it's better for them. Yeah, we think that they're not ready for this yet. We'll tell them later when they're ready. But we think that right now, it's better for them to believe that they live in a Disney kind of family than to know the sad truth. Okay, that to know that dad went to prison for doing something terrible. Okay, they'll find out. But right now, we think they need to have this other image of their family. Okay. By the same token, think of the Santa Claus or the Tooth Fairy. Tooth Fairy is not so, she doesn't reward you for doing good things, just reward you for something that happened to you. But Santa Claus, people think that their kids would be better off, that their kids will strive to be good in the hopes of Christmas rewards, and in the knowledge that Santa cares if you're good or bad, that Santa looks and checks if you're good or bad. Okay, if we told the children that, hey, Timmy, there's no Santa, nobody's looking, nobody can look, nobody can see if you're good or bad, so that's the real world. Okay. There's a reason why parents don't do this. Okay, they think that if they get this message that nobody can see, nobody cares, that maybe the kid will turn out to be a psychopath or a villain. Okay, so they're doing what Yadin is doing. And I saw earlier one of the comments saying that it's fine for kids, but we're not kids, which is true. Okay, that perhaps stories about Santa Claus and the Disney version of family history and the Masada story are appropriate for kids, but not for us, not for grown-ups. So there are two responses to that. There are two, they're not responses, they're questions. When you're sitting at the dinner table, when you're having a Christmas meal, okay, or Passover Seder, it's not just us, the adults, who can handle the truth, or the family reunion. It's not just for the old people. It's for the old people and the newcomers. The younger people, the in-laws, the children, they're all there at the table. So there's a reason why at the Christmas table, everybody shuts up about Santa Claus. Everybody toes the line with the line about Santa Claus, coming in through the chimney and rewarding the good, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, because there are children present. Okay, so to your point that it's appropriate for children, but not for us, well, children are present at the site where these stories are told. And so if it is appropriate for children, then we have to tell the children's version in these settings, in these venues. The second point is that, look, as a politician or as a leader, and as a Jewish leader, as a Zionist leader, and this is to the point of truth as a value. We could mark Yadin as having done the right thing as a leader of the Jewish people. Okay? He wanted to change lives and to save lives and to create a Jewish state that really did wind up saving thousands of lives, hundreds of thousands of Jewish lives. Those people who were chased out of Morocco and Tunisia and Yemen and Syria and Iraq, and later on Jews fleeing from Iran and from the Soviet Union and Somalia. So you can say that as a Jewish leader, it was a worthwhile trade-off. Okay, But as an archaeologist, he can't, you might even trust Yadin more as a leader because he could see things clearly. He could see the importance of, he could conceive of how to inspire and how to, and he could understand the need to do whatever it took to save Jews and to lead the Jews to Israel. But as a scholar, you'd never trust him again because you caught him in a lie. So think of, for example, if you think of some scientist who's also a policy activist. Okay, so you're in conflict with yourself about whether you should tell the scientific truth as it is, with all of its ambiguities and question marks and everything else, or should you, again, doctor it, edit it, highlight certain things, ignore other things in your public statements in order to get your public policy across. Okay, so it's it depends on which hat you're wearing. We all wear a number of hats. Okay, you're a lawyer, but also a Christian, and also a coach, and also a father, and also a friend, and a son, and a teammate, etc. And a political let's say you're some sort of activist or party official. You're all these things, okay? But each one of us has a hierarchy of what role is more important. Okay? So if being a husband is more important than being a professional, a lawyer, then when the two commitments clash, you'll pick your home life over your professional duties. Okay, if being a Christian is more important than being a son, then when your duties as a Christian conflict with your duties to your parents, you will put that first. Okay, so for Yadin, again, I'll repeat for the 17th time, if his critics really are correct, which I don't know. But for Yadin, if the accusation is correct, his role as a Zionist and as an Israeli and as a Jewish leader trumped his role as a scholar. Okay? And the result is that we might admire him as a founding father of Israel and as a leader, but we do not admire him, we do not trust him as a scholar anymore. Okay? Just like, look, if you invested in a startup company, and the owner of the startup company, if you saw that it's more important to him to be a good father, to have dinner every night with his family at home, and to go to his daughter's recitals and his son's baseball games, et cetera, then you might make a choice to not invest in that company. Okay? Because you'd see that the CEO of that company cares more about his daughter than about my money. Okay, so again, good for him. But that's his hierarchy of responsibilities. But I have a different hierarchy. And so I'll invest in some other company, okay, in which the CEO devotes full time to the company. Okay? So it's a kind of trade-off where if you choose to be a professional second, in Yadin's case, an archaeologist second, then you can't complain about not being trusted as a professional. I saw another comment above here about nationalism and chauvinism, and that these nationalist stories, national narratives, encourage chauvinism and conflict with neighbors and war, etc. So we can put that we can put that assumption to the test. We know, even those of us who are only mildly familiar with general history, we know that chauvinism and war and conflict existed in humanity for thousands of years before the idea of nationalism and melting pots, etc. Okay? So it's true that nationalism produced and produces conflicts and wars between nations. But I don't think anyone thinks that we would be at peace and harmony without nationalism. Okay, and again, if you look at history, you see the answer. Okay, so people organize themselves in empires or national states or city-states or tribes, and all of these organizations, all these modes of organization, I don't know if they produce wars and conflict, but people have wars and conflict in whichever social organization they form. Okay, so I don't think you can pin it on nationalism. And so whichever organization you have a certain framework and you tell certain stories about it to legitimize it. So, but that is true of a tribal organization and as a city-state organization and as a national state organization and imperial organization. So, like I said, I don't think you can identify nationalism as the cause of war and conflict, since historically nationalism is a relatively new phenomenon. Take away the Jews, which are unique in the ancient world in this respect. But war and conflict are as old as time. But the other thing you need to consider about, again, chauvinism and conflict and hatred of the other is to consider the inward effect of nationalism. Okay, so the outward effect is that you put barriers between you and the other. But think of our societies internally, what would happen to them without nationalism? Okay? So if it weren't for all these nationalizing stories that you've all heard and read and saw and were told all of your lives since infancy, would you really care? What would make you care about those New Yorkers who were attacked on September 11th? More so than the people who were attacked in the Bali bombings or the Madrid bombings? Would you have contributed blood and money and supported plans for defense against a recurrence the way that you did after September 11th? Okay, what's the difference between a New Yorker and a Madrider if you weren't exposed for years and years and years before September 11th to these nationalizing stories? What would make you care more about the New Yorker than about the Madrider? Okay, or for those who are Jewish in the room, in the audience, if you hadn't heard all your lives the stories of Hanukkah and Passover and the Holocaust and Israel's War of Independence and the Six-Day War, etc., would you really care about the fate of Jews who get attacked or persecuted in France or the USSR when they were trapped there, or in Somalia, or when there's a terrorist attack in Israel? Okay, what would make you care if you hadn't been conditioned to see those people, those strangers, as a kind of distant brother and sister to you? Okay. Would you donate to Jewish charities? Would you take Jewish history classes or Jewish studies classes in college if you didn't feel some sort of camaraderie? And how would you come to feel camaraderie and a special familial bond with these people if you were not exposed to stories that inspire this kind of, that kind of drip it into your brain, this notion that you and these other millions of strangers have a bond, that you form a community. And think about, if you say, okay, well, look, I can live without this communal sympathy, fine. But what about the democratic way that we organize ourselves? If you care about democracy, consider whether it's a coincidence that democracy came to us hand in hand with nationalism in the late 18th and 19th centuries. If you didn't feel a familial bond toward other Americans, would you agree to let a bunch of strangers in California and Kentucky and Illinois determine for you what kind of healthcare system you'll have here, or what kind of tax system you'll have here, or what kind of emission standards for your cars? Okay, look, I don't need to tell you that you would not let people in Congo or Argentina determine those things for you. Okay? But you let regularly, without giving it too much thought, you let people in 330 million people in 49 other states from Maine to Alaska do this. Okay? If you think of our political lives, you think that it's okay and even laudable and desirable for Americans to participate in the political process for electing our representatives and presidents, et cetera, et cetera. But Americans get very upset when they find out that Russians and Koreans and Brazilians and Ukrainians are participating in our political decision-making this way, with political donations and political ads, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so clearly you think of Americans as part of your community, but non-Americans, and therefore people in the community should, it's fine for them, it's legitimate for them to make these decisions together, but it's not okay for outsiders to do so. Okay, so you need to think of how you came to feel this sense of community with 330 million Americans. Okay? It happened by being exposed to these kinds of stories. Okay, you've developed a familial feeling towards members of your own nation that explains why you are willing to sacrifice your private interests for them. You think every time when one part of the country is hit by earthquakes or storms, or if tomorrow California were attacked by, or Hawaii attacked by Japan or China, you'd be expected to rebuild California with your tax dollars. And you'd be expected to fund, maybe go to war, to fund the war with China or Japan with your tax dollars, and maybe even join the army and risk death and whatever else to defend these strangers, complete strangers who live in California. Okay, so, and I know you'll do it because you've done it before. Okay, but you would never do it for, if the Chinese attacked the US, you'd do it for these strangers in California. But if China attacked Tibet or Japan or Taiwan, you wouldn't do it. Okay? And the reason is that you don't feel a family bond with people in Japan, Taiwan, Ukraine, Argentina, etc. Okay, and you do feel a bond towards American because you've been taught, the message has been impressed upon you through myriad stories, nationalizing stories, that these people are your family, are a kind of family to you. Okay, they're not real strangers. Just like the stranger who knocks on your door and tells you, "Hey, I'm Aunt Thelma's son." Okay, he looks like a stranger, but knowing that you have this connection transforms him into something that's less than a stranger, okay? Or I guess more than a stranger. less strange, less foreign to you. There's an instant bond there. So, and it's especially a question that is pertinent in countries like Israel and like the United States, that are a hodgepodge of different groups with different cultures and religious traditions and skin colors, et cetera, et cetera. There's a great deal of cultural diversity and ethnic diversity compared to places like France or Finland or Denmark. Okay, so maybe in Finland, the fact that they're a monoculture, ethnically, religiously, culturally, et cetera, means that there's enough of a family connection built in that you don't have to ideologically build it up as strongly as you do in a country that is so riven with internal division, with this kind of diversity, as the United States is, or as immigrant societies are, whether it's Brazil or Argentina or Canada or America or Israel. Okay. Every time when you hear cliches like diversity makes us stronger, we all kind of stop and think, some for longer, some for shorter. If can we really identify a society that we consider strong and resilient and healthy, which is characterized by a high degree of internal divisions? Okay, a survey of history reveals the commonsensical opposite: that communities that share these kinds of bonds, the communities that are resilient and unified, et cetera, usually have a high degree or a low degree of diversity. Okay, and so communities like ours with a high diversity rate, high immigrant societies, et cetera, they create a heightened alert about social and cultural and political division and strife and disintegration into tribalism. Okay, so high levels of diversity actually explains the desire to tell nationalizing stories, to Americanize or to Israeliize these multitudes, to create a kind of melting pot. And the tricky thing about history, and the reason why we always have these fights over history, in history textbooks and documentaries and museum exhibits, we don't have these fights about chemistry or even literature, is that history is our civics lesson. Okay, so we all, I think we, I forget who it was who said earlier, who wrote earlier that it's not appropriate for kids. Yeah, I'm sorry, that this kind of white lies for civics purposes is appropriate for kids, but not for us adults. Okay, so I think his comment is widely accepted. Now, we all agree that scholars and graduate students at university should follow the evidence where it leads, regardless of ideology and politics and melting pots, et cetera, and civics. And I think most of us, the vast majority of us, also agree that children's cartoons about history and history books for first and second graders should not include the full, nuanced, complex history of George Washington. The stories that are less inspiring. Okay, the uglier side of the Great Generation, or Martin Luther King, or George Washington, or Abraham Lincoln. Okay, so at that age, we want to tell parts of history as a civics lesson, just like we do with Santa Claus. So the reason we get into fights over history is that we don't have the same notion of, all of us don't have an agreed idea of what age we should move from history as history as civics to history as history. Okay, from civics to the historical truth. Just like your family might tell your children the truth about Santa Claus at the age of 7, and I might tell my child about Santa Claus at the age of 27. Okay? Some of us are more protective than others. So but of course the difference is that when it comes to Santa, everybody decides for himself. Okay, I'll tell my kid when I think it's right, when I think he's ready for it. Okay, when I think the benefits of the Santa Claus stories have done their, when he's vested with the good parts, good consequences of the Santa Claus story. Okay, but when it comes to textbooks, public education, museums, et cetera, we have to do it together. As a society, as a school board, as a curriculum committee, as a legislature. And we're bound to disagree about when to switch, what age it's appropriate to switch from history as civics to history proper, and how abrupt this transition should be. Should you just go from telling the story about Jefferson as a hero to Jefferson as a really complicated character with all the racial issues, et cetera? Just in an abrupt transition. Okay? And the reason we differ on this is because we differ on when we think our young people are sufficiently socialized into our society and culture. Okay, again, at one point are they already vested in our values, so they can now switch from history as civics to history as history. Okay, is it middle school or high school or college or maybe only after college? Okay, so it really is a difficult question to answer, even just on the issue of Santa Claus, like individually. For one person, it's a difficult question to answer, for one parent. When you're talking about 330 million parents, we need to decide together and arrive at the same answer. It's more than difficult, it's impossible. Okay. Now, we probably need to say goodbye. It's been a very long session. I appreciate you sticking with me. But I'd like to get to the question that was asked, because when I started, I said that part of this talk is about how historians don't get history. And so what do I mean by that? My sense is that historians who complain about inaccuracies in popular histories and documentaries and textbooks, etc., museum displays, they miss a big point about history. In the sense that historians find themselves at odds with normal people about what they think history, the primary function of history is. Historians see history as a history textbook, okay, as something that conveys the truth about the past, okay? But audiences see history differently, not as a guide to understanding the past, but as a guide to understanding the present. It's a guide to understanding the society, the culture, the situation in which I live today. Okay, so history to most people is either a morality tale to help us consider our private lives or public policy today, or it's a tale of how that explains how we got to the state of affairs today, to help us understand the context of current events and help us shape policy solutions for the future. So the point is that for historians, in their own little fields of specialization, history really is about the past. Okay, and therefore they're pedantic about, it wasn't this way, it was that way. But for most people, history is not about the past, it's about the present. So the historian goes on television and radio and talks at museums and explains to the obtuse audience that they're wrong on the historical facts. And historians resent the fact that the crowds are resistant. Okay, we resent them for being resistant to these facts and figures that we offer. Or we resent them for not caring that they hold in their heads these factually wrong histories about whatever, Texas Rangers or the Civil War or the New Deal or the Revolution. Okay. And again, I'm not getting on a high horse. I've been one of these historians myself with regard to my niche field, my field of expertise. But the point is that when, look, even that historian, even I, when I don't discuss the one field that I know very well, how did I form my understanding of French history or modern U.S. 20th century history? I'm not a historian of modern U.S. So I imbibed it, I absorbed it through all just like non-historians do. Okay, so I hold in my head various historical myths that are of dubious accuracy, but they explain to me the world in which I live and the culture in which I live. So I'm not saying that historians shouldn't be historians, okay, or that they shouldn't approach history like historians do. All I'm saying is that historians shouldn't walk around rolling our eyes about people having a simplistic view of history and not caring to learn a more nuanced and more accurate history, because those people are not the weirdos. Okay? The historian is the weirdo. Okay? History is about the past for a few of us. For most normal people, it's about the present. So these nationalizing functions of history, for most people, are the point of history. It's not to learn, what the specifics of what happened in this particular battle as opposed to that particular battle. Those things aren't important to most people. Okay, thank you very much for inviting me and for your questions. And if you have other questions, you have my email address, so I'd be happy to correspond with you further about any of these things. Thanks. Good day.